Welcome to Law and Life, the Levoritz Approach.
Hello and welcome to Law and Life, the Levoritz Approach with attorney YoniLevoritz. Yoni is the founder of Levoritz Law Firm and is recognized for his exceptional skill in family law, his compassionate manner, and his commitment to achieving favorable outcomes for his clients. I am your host, Kevin Rosenquist, and in today's episode, we're talking about what's at stake during asset disputes. Yoni, welcome back.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you for having me. Always good to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited to pick your brain about this one. Can you start by explaining what constitutes a contentious asset dispute in a divorce and why these typically arise?
Well, they can arise for several reasons. Okay. A contentious asset dispute is where both parties or one of the parties is claiming that an asset, okay, is basically in dispute in terms of whether it's separate property, in terms of whether it's marital property, in terms of whether they should get credit for something, in terms of whether property should be returned, in terms of marital waste, if someone wasted a lot of money during the course of the marriage, gambling, girlfriends, boyfriends, things of that sort. So when we talk about assets, we're talking about a very large group of things, and all of them have a dollar value attached to them.
Okay. And what are some of the most common types of assets that tend to be contested during a divorce?
Most common types, I would say, are probably real estate that was fraudulently transferred or transferred to a third party. Okay. Cash. People go to cash machines, ATMs, and start taking out money before they're divorced to start pocketing extra money, or taking out advances on the ATM when they go to the grocery store to start pocketing extra money and start building up their coffers. Then, of course, we have situations where people simply go out and they start spending money to increase their lifestyle and to try and change the facts on the ground in terms of the actual divorce itself.
Wow. So can you elaborate a little more on the fraudulent real estate? That's really interesting.
Sure. Somewhat common situation, in certain communities, in certain places. Basically what happens is, you're going to be going through a divorce. You know that a divorce is heading down the pike. So you go ahead and let's say you have a vacation home and the vacation home is in your name. So you don't need the wife to sign off on it. You don't need, your significant other to sign off on it. And then you go ahead and you sell it for something well below market value. Or you just transfer it to your brother saying, I owed my brother a lot of money and therefore I transferred the house to him. These are typically looked at as fraudulent conveyances. They're transfers made without fair consideration, without a fair amount of money being paid for them. And therefore, at that point in time, they're subject to being recouped, either the property itself or as a form of marital waste.
That's so interesting to me. I just feel like it's one of those things that I feel like you're not going to get away with that, right? I mean, like they sometimes, I guess maybe they do get away with that sort of stuff.
Sometimes they do get away with it. Yes. Not often, but there are people who I've seen get away with it.
That's interesting. It's just like I said, it's one of those things I feel like it's just the percentage of the success percentage is low. So you shouldn't try to do that. But,
well, you shouldn't do it because it's going to look bad in front of the judge. And if you have a decent lawyer or you have a good lawyer, the first thing the lawyer is going to do is move to bring the asset back into the marital pot. These are also very common in terms of, LLCs or companies and corporations, especially in families, where they think, oh, if I just take back the stock, it's not going to be a marital asset. Well, it might not be a marital asset anyway, because it may have been a gift from the family, which would make it not a marital asset. But assuming that they want to play these games, there are lots of games that are played in terms of, these types of assets.
I can only imagine what you've seen in your career as far as games go, Yoni.
Yes, I see them on a daily basis.
So maybe let's start here. How are assets typically divided in a divorce? What legal principles guide the division, especially in contentious cases?
Well, the contentious and non-contentious are governed by the same laws. Okay, it's Domestic Relations Law, Section 236, which contains a whole slew, I think it's 16 factors, basically, where, you go through the age of the parties, the health of the parties, what income they came in with, what income they have now, who helped you get that degree, who helped you achieve success, who helped you achieve, everything that you have gotten through in life while your wife or significant other was taking care of the children, or you were taking care of the children, and you supported your wife while she was out conquering the world. But there are lots of factors, but there are many factors, and those factors apply whether it's contentious or uncontentious, or it's somewhat peaceful. But The way they're applied is very different because the split in an equitable distribution state like New York, okay, is based upon the equities of the matter. And that means it's based upon fairness. So if someone goes ahead and transfers out that property and you can't get that property back, well, someone's entitled to a credit. Someone opens up an irrevocable trust and they put tons of marital money in there and they don't tell the other party. Well, the other party may be entitled to, if they can't set aside the trust, to get a large credit for what was put into the trust.
I would imagine a contentious situation will take a lot longer.
It does. Discovery is longer. Looking at documents takes more time. Working with the parties takes more time. Everything is prolonged.
And a lot more uncomfortable for everyone involved.
Absolutely, yes.
Can you describe the difference between community property and equitable distribution and how these concepts kind of affect the asset division in divorce cases?
Well, I can't say much on community property because New York is not a community property state. But what I can say is it's not based upon fairness. Equity or equitable distribution is based on fairness. Community property is pretty much a 50-50 split of whatever is out there in terms of assets or liabilities, or there are exceptions to these things. I just don't know them because I don't deal with community property states.
Okay. But for equitable distribution, how is that? Is it just those 16 points that you were talking about as far as how to determine equitable distribution?
Yes, but the last point is whatever the court deems just and proper. So that opens up the world to everything, basically.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. If that's the case, then does a contentious divorce change the way a judge might see it?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Interesting.
If you go ahead and try and destroy the other person on social media, judge is going to look at that askew and say, hey, listen, maybe you shouldn't get 50%. Maybe you should get 40% or 30%. Or if you've got a deadbeat dad who just doesn't want to take care of the kids and he's sitting at home and you're working day and night, well, maybe the husband doesn't deserve a large share of the estate. Maybe he deserves zero part of the estate. There are cases where people get zero. There are cases where people get 40% or 60%. The percentages are all over the place because every case is different. Now, when you settle a case, you typically go 50-50, but not always.
What are the challenges involved in identifying and accurately valuing assets during a divorce, especially during a contentious divorce where communication is not maybe the best?
A lot of it is searching through bank statements, credit card statements, doing asset searches, looking for any particular way of finding an asset. Once you find an asset, then you have to value it. So when you're valuing the asset, most of the time accountants come in, let's say it's a business. So you've got the income approach, you've got the market approach, you got the asset approach. I'm sure there are other approaches, which I'm not thinking of at the moment, but those are the three basic approaches. And what you see is the accountants go ahead and they value these different entities, to figure out how much they're worth.
What are the most complex assets to value? I would imagine businesses can be really tricky.
Large businesses, and I shouldn't even say large, I would say mid-range to large, where there aren't that many being sold or bought, or they're unique in nature. Therefore, you really have to apply an income-based approach, which means people do it all the time. They put things on their corporate credit cards, which they shouldn't. They put things in their corporate bank accounts that they shouldn't. They commingle their assets, which they shouldn't. Your corporation should remain separate from you as a person. You get your W-2 and that's it. You shouldn't be looking to take anything else from the business. But people don't do that. They commingle all the time and they try and figure out all these different types of interesting write-offs, which don't exist or couldn't exist or are subject to contest in the litigation, which causes you to use the income approach, as opposed to a market approach where you're dealing with something where lots of businesses have been sold and you can look in the area and say, hey, this business has been sold in the area. Well, maybe it's comparable. Maybe it's not comparable.
Okay. I want to go back to talk a little bit more about the business interests, because if one party in a marriage owns the business or is the maybe CEO, owner, whatever you want to say, but does the spouse get something from that business?
Yes, they typically do. Not necessarily 50%, but they typically get some portion of the business because a business is what's called an active asset. Therefore, there's a lot of sweat equity in that business. But what happens is if you have two spouses who are working in the business or two spouses who own stock in the business, well, then you're going to have a very different situation. Maybe the business should be sold. Maybe one person should buy out the other person. Maybe it's just a matter of figuring out if one person is not as interested in the business as the other. There was a recent case. It involved I forget the name of the actress from the Netflix show Unorthodox. She ended up with the entirety of the business as a result of the fact that the husband fired her, and as a result of the fact that the husband defaulted, and as a result of the fact the husband at first claimed there was lots of marital waste by her, but then couldn't prove anything and was lying to the court. So she ended up with 100% of the business. But that is not a very common result. Most common results are 20, 30% of a business, especially when one spouse works the business, and that is how they're going to generate money to pay their child support or other obligations.
Okay. So when that business is valued, and if the other spouse maybe was a stay-at-home mom or stay-at-home dad, they get a percentage of what that business is worth?
That is correct.
And that's just a check, or is it like about how much that business makes over a certain amount of time? Do they get continuous payouts, or is it like a one-time thing?
It's like a one-time thing. It's not like an annuity. It's not like this business is going to pay you out on a regular basis based upon its profits. It's going to be valued. The business is going to be looked at by the accountant. They're going to come up with a number. Maybe it's $1 million. Maybe it's $10 million. Maybe it's $50 million. But you're going to receive a check or a comparable sum, maybe from the house, maybe from other assets, maybe from, trading and swapping things, where you can figure out how to get your share of the business.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Especially, I feel like that's probably pretty easy if it's not contentious. But when it is contentious, I suppose trying to figure out and negotiate all those different pieces gets really complex.
Sure, we saw that with Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt over their wine business, over their winery. They couldn't establish themselves. Both parties wanted it. Both parties were playing games with it. So you run into situations like that all the time.
What steps should be taken if one spouse believes the other is undervaluing business assets or hiding valuable property during a divorce?
Well, it's really two different questions. About hiding, you have to first locate it. You can't just say they're hiding money. You have to have some proof to support the notion that they're hiding money. Money that's missing from a business, money that's missing from bank accounts, money that's missing from credit cards, cash income, which can't necessarily be accounted for, that comes in from an operating business, where you can show, listen, there's cash there's cash that comes in every day, but the cash is not making it from the store to the bank. Okay. So sometimes you can trace the cash. That's hiding. In terms of the actual business itself of being, devalued, let's say, then you're putting yourself in a situation where you have to hire your own expert. And that expert reviews the neutral expert's opinion, because courts typically appoint a neutral expert, and that neutral expert values the business for the court for both parties, and both parties pay a portion of the retainer for that particular business appraisal.
And so someone might disagree with that neutral party, that's when you're saying they should hire their own expert?
That's when we bring in the own expert. Yep. That's when we hire them.
Okay. And is it usually when someone feels that the business is being undervalued, do they just feel like they know the business well enough to know that someone's trying to pull a fast one?
Well, you can tell based upon the reports many times. I mean, for example, if the business doesn't includes cash that's coming in, but in the income approach, they're not actually attributing cash income to the business itself, well, then you can say, well, you've got a whole bunch of money that's missing here. What are you doing to account for it? And then you say, basically, listen, you've got to add some sort of cushion for that cash that's missing, and say 20% is cash, 30% is cash, and then add that to the value of the business.
All right, Yoni. Well, that's interesting stuff as always. And thank you for tuning into Law and Life, the Levoritz Approach with attorney YoniLevoritz. To connect with Yoni, head to levoritzlaw.com, and please like and subscribe to our channel and leave us a review. Yoni, always great having you. Thanks so much for all the insight.
Thank you, Kevin. Great to be here.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.